Tomorrow's human performance and wellness. Like I said earlier today, an area that's very near and dear to my heart. It's one of those that hits close to home for many of us. The longevity of the soft operator, both mentally and physically, is a key focus area for soft leadership. And after, like I said, spending 20 of my 25 years in that community, it's definitely a critical piece of the pie. So we've brought together some top experts in a variety of fields to discuss what needs to be done to maintain our current operators and their families and ensure optimal performance for the warfighter of the future.
Next, we have Dr. Alexander Chriest, the Chief Content Officer and Impact Coach at the Impact Human Performance, who's been married for 2 weeks and is on his honeymoon at Fort Bragg right now with you all.
Yes, it's going to be a long marriage. But my background is kind of scattered, but my doctorate is in educational psychology and really focused on motivation, perseverance, and resilience. I started working with athletes and started seeing that some of the principles we use with them could be applied in the corporate, military, government areas. And we partner with these organizations to help people show up as their best more often. So we focus a lot on stress and recovery, the energy you bring forth in any given moment. And that's something that we've been evolving more and more. And I think 2020 really helped us kind of get to the front of the line for certain things that weren't talked about before are now being talked about. So it's a good climate to help people, really recover from the stressors in their lives.
And Alexander, back to you. Let's talk about you work in a human performance space, specifically long-term resilience. So can you just talk to us about what do we need on a regular basis that helps us build or improve our resilience?
Yes, and going off of what Jeff just said, it's the recovery piece. I think so often we have stress, more stress, more stress, and we use it as a blanket statement. We don't get down to what the actual stressors are in our lives. And I always use the analogy, it's like a pot, and we just keep putting all of our stressors in this pot, whether it be traffic, work, spouse, family, friends, pandemic, you name it. And typically what happens is when that pot overflows, it's not the stressors that were causing it that were around. It's when we lash out at our family members, we lash out at our friends. And without intentional recovery throughout your day, what we call even micro bursts of activity or recovery, we just run the risk of this boil over. So what are the small things you can do throughout your day to help you recover?
For Alexander, because it's a personal question really, what should I be doing throughout my day to get micro bursts of resiliency? If you could give some examples and I could put it into practice, like today.
Today, all right.
Yeah.
There's a 25% chance that I was going to be the one that asked the first question. But I think what tends to happen too is we see this a lot at work. People show up at what we call their best at work, and then oftentimes we go home and we aren't showing up as our best. So work sees the good side of us, home sees the maybe not so good side of us, and we're okay with that because we tell the stories around it. They understand I'm doing it for them. And it can be anything, when we talk about recovery, even the research around recovery, it wasn't until really 2006 that it gets outside of really addiction recovery is where a lot of it looked at. So it's still a relatively new area of research in terms of this micro recovery throughout your day, but it can be anything. It's a break from what you're doing. It could be going for a quick little walk. It could be standing up. There's times I even pre-COVID, talked about washing my hands. I wash my hands all the time, but the way I view it is when I'm washing my hands, I would, intentionally do some deep breathing, deep breath work. Just calm myself, visualize what's going on. But it can be anything throughout the day, but I think what tends to happen is the things that we think of recovery may not be. Recovery is answering this email, or recovery is calling my family member. There's certain times I love my mom to death, but calling her isn't always recovery. Don't tell her that. But I think it's these small moments. And the stories we always hear is I don't have time, or this small amount of recovery isn't going to do anything. But if you do it throughout the day, I always just say every hour, try to move, get up. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else. You get caught up in it's meeting after meeting after meeting, and you blink and you've gone through lunch, you haven't taken a break, and then you come home burnt out. So it is the smallest of things. Going outside, looking outside, watching a funny video, listening to Hall & Oates, whatever it may be, it can be just these small moments. But don't try to get away from telling a story I only have 5 minutes, so that's not enough to do anything.
Alex, I'm going to ask you to talk about, because I think the space you work in is, I want to make you mentally strong before you need it, right? And I know you work in the private sector as well, so can you talk about, I mean, I think I look at this from the executive coaching perspective. You recommend an executive coach to someone and they're like, oh, I must be terrible. Well, no, maybe I want to make you really good because I think you're a high performer with high potential, and I'm looking out for your next promotion, your next opportunity. So what are we looking at when we are doing things before the boom, as we like to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's training more than anything else. Like, we look at it from the athletic perspective. I think from the outside looking in, athletes are sometimes just gifted athletes. They're just good at it. But what you don't see is the work they're doing behind the scenes. Like, they're constantly training. And I love the idea of just reframing, like, just the mental fitness is a big one. I mean, we talk about it sometimes. We go through programs and they're like, I don't like the word stress. The word stress stresses me out. Just stop using the word stress. We're not going to get rid of the word stress, but what's going to happen is, like, even just by reframing it to a challenge can make a big deal. And we've had people within the intelligence agency. I had someone come up to me. He had a big transformation through a program where he went, at the beginning, he was like, I don't know why people are stressed about these small things. And I'm like, oh, you're the leader. This isn't going to go well. It's going to be a long day. But then by the end, he said, what I realized is in the last several years, he had been involved in a suicide bombing. He had been shot. And he's like, the thing that's going to kill me is how I respond to traffic. He was well trained in those other areas, but what he didn't train for is the thing that he's doing every single morning, every single evening. And it's training for those small, like those chronic low-level stressors, like the gas pedal analogy. It's always running. Like, if it's idling all the time and you're idling at a higher rate, you're going to burn yourself out or burn the engine out more quickly. So how can you train for the things that you're not going to get rid of? I mean, the biggest stressors that we hear people saying, it's traffic, it's family, it's friends, things we probably can't get rid of. So how can we train ourselves to handle that more effectively? And it's viewing it as training. It's taking advantage of opportunities where you can push yourself, just like in the gym. If you're going to run a marathon, you're not going to go and just run 26.2 miles. You're going to progressively work up to it and make sure you're recovering adequately. I like the rucksack more than the bucket, and I don't know what helo means.
Helicopter.
And I think going on the culture piece, I mean, we see this all the time where organizations come to us and say, our culture's broken, fix it. And so often people just wait for the culture.
Yeah.
Like, well, once the leaders start doing it, I'll do it.
No.
And how can we get back, and I'm a researcher, but at the same time, I have a love-hate relationship with research. Like, do I need research to tell me that if I take 5 deep breaths, I feel better?
Right.
Like, sometimes we just wait for the research where it's like, what's practical? I mean, we had a group with military personnel a couple weeks ago go through a program, and it was like day one, they're like, we better not be doing that meditation stuff because we don't like meditation, it doesn't work for me. And I had a colleague of mine, friend of mine, go through, and he's like, it's interesting because what people don't realize is, like, you're shooting, when you learn to shoot, what are you doing? Feel the gun, feel it against your body, take a breath, pause. I don't want to ruin anyone's day, but you're meditating. And like, we let these words become barriers. And, we can get this collective culture slowly by sharing these experiences. I mean, during COVID, I would teach programs to corporate executives, and we'd spend 3 hours on the introduction. And the introduction was, what's your name and what's been your biggest challenge over the last 6 months? And that started a conversation of just like people, oh wow, I thought I was alone in this. Like, we're taking the silos down and helping people understand that we all face unique challenges, but we all face the same challenges. And it's the same with individuals and also cultures, because we'll go into companies and they'll say, hey, we're unique. Like, our problems are different than everyone else's. I'm like, oh yes, I'm sure they are. Let me hear them. And it's like, we're working more with less. Oh wow, I've never heard that before. Like, there's uncertainty. There's like, regardless of the sector, we're all very similar. Regardless of where we teach this in the world, we're all human. And we're trying in many ways to do the same thing. It just looks a little different. But I think having that, like, trying to shift where we're not waiting to have someone else do it. It's not a rolling deadline. Like, I'll take care of myself once I'm out. Once my kids graduate. Once I get used to this role. Like, what are the small things we can start today? Because, I mean, I'm sure we've all been there. I mean, you wake up, it's 10 years later, and you're like, man, I really wish I would have started exercising, taking care of myself 10 years ago. But what are the small things we can start now? It doesn't have to be a 10. Like, what's a 1 look like? What's a 2 look like if we're looking at a dial? It doesn't have to be like an on or off. But maybe it's starting small, and then we build momentum from there. We do something we call intentional tasking, where it's just like set a timer for 10 minutes, focus on one thing and do it. Like I use my microwave timer at home all the time. If I'm doing dishes, 5 minutes. But when you have multiple things going on, your brain's just jumping back and forth between tasks and you're less efficient. So the whole day can go on and feel like you don't get anything done. So setting time for certain things and be very intentional about it can help.